Molly Samuel is WABE's environmental reporter. WABE is the local affiliate of NPR radio here in Georgia. Her job is to cover everything from politics to economics to equity, anything that has to do with the environment, and show us how it impacts our lives here in Georgia. She is going to join us to talk about her work, share some of the backstories of the pieces she has done, and offer us her best advice. So, Molly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
How are you feeling today?
I'm good.
Reading your tweets today, and you got a few surprises. You are getting adjusted to being out there in the field after the pandemic. What happened?
Yeah, so I mean I have been getting out and doing interviews, but one of the kinds of stories I really love is like getting out into the woods and talking with researchers or other kinds of experts, just being out there in the wild. And so I was very happy to get back out on a story where I was getting completely eaten by mosquitoes and dodging poison ivy, and the person I was interviewing pulled a tick off of him. And that's how I knew. I was like, all right, I'm really back.
So, actually, this is a good introduction to what your work is like. Tell us what your normal work day, work week is like. How different is the work of an environmental reporter from other kinds of stories and reporting?
Shortest answer to this, and it's always why people ask me, when people ask me, do you like doing environment reporting? My answer is always like, listen, the combination of being a radio reporter and environment reporter is very good for me because I cannot dress nicely. I'm just incapable of dressing up. And the people who have to go down to the state capitol and wear suits or wear hose or wear heels, I can't do it. Like, I've got to be the person in the muddy jeans and beat up sneakers. And so that is the short answer of my like happy place for reporting. But I mean, day to day, sometimes I am out with scientists in some wild, beautiful place. Those are often very fun days. A lot of days I'm sitting at my computer reading research or going back through interviews or doing phone or Zoom interviews or writing a story. Sometimes I do have to go down to the Capitol or to the Public Service Commission or other, hearings or policy kind of things to get interviews and to get sound there too. So it really depends on the day and on the week.
So, how do you find stories?
It is a real mix, I would say. And there's one story that I was going to use as an example about the Lake Charlotte Nature Preserve, which is a story that I did last year about this really big piece of land that the city of Atlanta is buying to make into a new park. And I first learned about that story because another reporter who covers Atlanta City Council really closely, she wrote up an article that City Council had approved this spending to buy this park. And so I read her article and was like, oh, that's interesting. But her perspective and her coverage was from City Council. And so one place that reporters often find stories is just reading other people's reporting and figuring out how to advance it. So I saw her story and was like, maybe I could actually go there. But this was right in the middle of the pandemic. All I was really doing was covering COVID at that time. So I sort of like back in my mind, but I didn't do anything with it. And then, so that's one place to find stories. Other people's reporting, figure out what the next day story is, the next week story, the next month. There's always a way to advance a story. And if you're trying to figure out how to do that, you can just call the people who were quoted in the story and say, hey, I'm from this other outlet, wondering what the next step is. It's very, this is something that reporters do. So then my second way that I heard about this story was my neighbor across the street is an ecologist, and he actually knew about this property and was really excited about it. And so we were just chatting on the sidewalk one day and he mentioned this to me. So that's another great place for reporters to find stories is your community. What are your neighbors talking about? What questions do your friends have? What are your family members saying they wish they were reading about or seems like isn't being covered? Every reporter brings a different community to your newsroom, and don't ever discount just the power of your community. And then the third way that I heard about this story was the Conservation Fund, the nonprofit involved in this project, actually just emailed me and pitched me this story. They said, hey, would you like to do a story about this park? And at that point, I was finally like, okay, yes, I have time. I'm going to do this story. But I think, part of what made this story end up standing out to me is that the main voice is a woman who lives near this property and has lived near it for decades and has had for decades fought a landfill being built on this property. And I found her because I asked the Conservation Fund, who else should I talk to? You know, as I was reporting the story, I didn't just stop with talking with the environmental activists. I asked my contact there, who else should I talk to? And he gave me her name. And she ended up being the heart of this story, this community member. So anyway, that's not exactly another way to find a story, but another way to find sources is to ask whoever you're talking to, who else you should talk to. And it may connect you with some really great people.
And how do you deal with, I see you write in very simple language, which is so important and so difficult for all of us who are in this field. How do we simplify things because they're so complex? How do you do that?
So I think the short answer is because I'm a radio reporter, I have to. You just can't use really long, complex sentences. You can't get really deep into numbers or data or wonky language on the radio because you'll lose people. You know, I always, even when I'm interviewing somebody, if I feel like they're being really wonky and technical, I'll do things like say, hey, listen, whoever's listening to my story, they're going to be driving on the, you know, I-285 on the perimeter around Atlanta, trying to get home from work. And they're thinking about what is for dinner tonight. Help me explain to them why what you're telling me is important. And I'll just say that, you know, kind of point blank. If I find that I'm having a really hard time with a wonky term or a sentence that feels really wonky or clunky, or even if my editor says, hey, I don't understand what you're talking about there, and I'm not able to explain it, it usually means I don't totally understand it. And I might need to do more reporting. So if you can't simplify something in your head, it might make sense to back up and just say, do I understand what I'm talking about? Like, why can't I simplify it? And you might figure out that you've still got some questions that you need to ask somebody or do more research on. So that's one thing I think about is if I can't simplify it, what am I missing? A lot of times with a story, if I'm trying to figure out just how to tell it in a like kind of approachable way, I'll just sort of sit and imagine if I was calling my mom and telling her what this story is, how would I tell her this story? And that oftentimes ends up being what my lead is or how I start reporting, you know, how I sort of start writing the narrative. Because I really am, for radio especially, but I think this holds for, you know, written articles too. I am storytelling. I mean, even though obviously it's all reporting and it's all factual, I mean, I sort of need to think about how to grab people and keep them listening.
Another thing that is difficult is how to localize. Some of these issues are so big, and I remember reading your article on the Biden climate agenda, and I like how you localized it by talking to experts and asking each one of them to tell us what are the aspects of that climate plan that really impact Georgians. Tell us a little bit about how you localize stories.
Yeah. And I think you can do this with a lot of things, right? But especially, you know, I think in the next 4 years, we're probably going to be seeing a lot of federal climate policies, whether they go anywhere or not, they're going to be talking about them. And so there's definitely opportunities to just figure out, how does this apply here? Would Georgians actually experience this? I think there's a lot of times you hear about policy and it's like, well, does this actually affect anyone's life? You know, does it actually mean anything? And so I think trying to localize, you know, policy kind of stuff can really explain to people why it matters or doesn't matter, or how it could affect their lives or might not actually affect their lives. So, you know, when I see stuff like this, you know, the Biden climate agenda, it's this big, a lot of it's sort of theoretical right now. We're seeing, you know, whether any of it will actually happen or not. But you've always got local experts who can probably speak to at least specific pieces of it. It depends where you are. But, you know, for UGA, for instance, I think about, he's doing a lot of stuff talking about agriculture and farmers and you know, USDA type stuff. UGA has so many agriculture experts that I'm sure there are really great professors who are thinking about this stuff and could, you know, help localize, how do some of these policies, how might they affect Georgia farmers? And from there, you could then take you get that expert, that local expert who can explain how a federal policy could affect somebody on the ground. If they can explain how this policy might affect Georgia farmers, well, then you could go find a Georgia farmer and say, what do you think about this policy? And then you have sort of a regular person affected by things voice. You have probably a little bit of a scene on their farm.
And what about workflow? It's one thing to find the story, and then you talk about how much time it takes. Sometimes you have to go back, and as you say, if you can't explain it to your mom, I have to go and do some more reporting. So obviously you have to keep working on several stories at the same time. How do you organize yourself?
I mean, in terms of organization, I use a website called Trello to track story ideas. And so I'll track, I'll just, every time I have a story idea, I just drop it in Trello. And that way it's not taking up space in my mind. Like, I know that I'm writing down my story ideas, so I don't have to keep track of them in my head. And so that's like just a little bit of extra brain space available for me. So I'll have like a list of story ideas, and then I'll have a list of like actually want to pitch. So that's gone from story idea to I've actually done some pre-interviews. I know what the story is. And then I have pre-reporting, which is, the pitch has been assigned. I'm getting ready to get out there. And then reporting, those are stories that I'm actually actively out getting interviews on. And then usually my next column is just like finished, because once I'm reporting, things are moving so quickly that it's just, I'm not tracking it anymore in Trello. So that's one tool that's been really useful for me, that helps me stress out slightly less, I think, because.
Is there anything when you were starting out that scared you, that you wished you had done differently?
So a good piece of advice that somebody gave me when I was starting out that I really took to heart, and I feel like it served me extremely well as an intern and in getting my first job, was he just said, don't blow it. I mean, which is very concise, kind of blunt newsroom kind of talk. But I mean, I think what I took that to mean is like, if an editor assigns you a story and for whatever reason your source doesn't work out or your story doesn't work out, in a newsroom, you can't come back to your editor and be like, it didn't work out. Like, find a different story, find an alternative source, like go back to your editor and say, I'm sorry, this source didn't work out, but I called these 3 other people and I'm waiting to hear back from them, and I'll keep you in the loop. Something that I feel like I've gotten more confident about and more comfortable about, and I've already sort of alluded to this, is just that doing the extra work to make sure you're getting things right. Like, you will sleep so much better at night if you're confident that your story is right. And, for me, it often just takes the form of, once I've written a story and I'm ready to go get an edit with my editor, I'll actually go through the story, and this sounds sort of dumb, but I will make a bullet pointed list of every fact in the story, everything that is like being said in the story. And then I'll just like send that list to a bunch of people and be like, am I summarizing this right? Is this accurate? Do I have this number right? Sometimes it's things that I know are right. But I just want to get that double check on it. Folks are usually very happy to do that because they understand that I'm trying to get things right. It's incredibly helpful when I got something wrong and somebody says, you didn't actually summarize that quite right, and here's why. I mean, just making sure you understand things.
So what are some other stories that you feel are not getting enough coverage that students should look in Georgia to cover?
Nothing, because I don't want you to compete with me. Just kidding. There's so much. I think, one of the things about being an environment reporter in Georgia that I guess could be both good or bad, but I think is mostly bad, is that there's not very many environment reporters in Georgia. It's, for whatever reason, this beat is really undercovered here. I think, maybe more competitive reporters would be like, well, that's great because I get to break lots of stories. But in my opinion, I mean, I just wish a lot more people were covering this stuff because it's so important. So this is sort of a non-answer. I think there's a lot of climate topics, especially solutions. I think solution stories are really great. And, whenever you see a problem out there, one way to advance a story, we were talking about advancing stories earlier. One way to advance a story is just say, well, who's doing this well? Like, who's found a good solution to this? So we're seeing a lot of energy transition kind of stuff start happening here, as coal plants are closing, and Georgia is very big in the solar industry, sort of, you could definitely be localizing solar stories or coal plant closure stories. Electric vehicles are really growing here in Georgia. Georgia's a wonderful place to be reporting on EVs because people are interested in them and a lot of people are talking about them. And I think, if you're looking for stories in Athens, you can be asking, what is, the mayor and the city council, what are they doing on climate change? What is UGA doing on sustainability? A lot of companies are making promises right now, but you can always go back and say, okay, well, you made this promise, but what are you actually doing about it? You could ask your city council, you made clean energy commitments. What have you done to follow up on those? So accountability stories like that are always really helpful, I think.
What's your favorite part of this job?
My favorite part is being in the woods and getting bitten by mosquitoes. I could skip the mosquitoes part. Um, no ticks. I don't want ticks.
Yeah.
I like being out there. I like being out. It doesn't have to be in the woods. I like being out and talking to people. That's the most fun part of the job. I think that's probably for a lot of reporters. That's the most fun. Is just learning something new. Like our entire job is learning new things all the time. That's like a crazy privilege. So, yeah.
Molly, thank you so much and best of luck to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and your students.